While the suspect in the Atlanta murders claims a sex addiction drove him, there is no escaping the fact that 6 of the 8 victims were women of Asian descent. And the murders happened against a backdrop of more anti-Asian hate crimes being reported since the start of the pandemic. Even former President Trump made blatantly racist anti-Asian comments when talking about the coronavirus. All of that has led many people, especially many Asian Americans, to believe the shooter was racially motivated. Some with ties to the evangelical community have a different perspective. An article in the New York Times outlines how the fixation on sex is an ongoing issue inside the evangelical community. The suspect was raised in that community. Joining us now is the author of that article, Ruth Graham. She is a national correspondent covering religion, faith, and values with the New York Times. Ruth, welcome. It's great to have you with us. So in your article, you note that some people familiar with evangelical communities are making a connection between the violence and the suspect's strict religious beliefs. Can you tell us about the role his beliefs may have played in all of this?
Sure. Yeah. And I should emphasize this is one piece of a puzzle that is still being figured out. But we do know that Long told the police he had a sexual addiction. We know a former roommate has said that he blocked certain websites on his computer, used a flip phone for a while to try to avoid pornography. He had sought help for all of this at a Christian rehab clinic. And that he told his roommate that he feared falling out of God's grace. So clearly sort of seeing this through a religious lens. We also know he was a faithful member of a conservative Southern Baptist church in the area that did teach, again, this is mainstream in these circles, but, just teaching total abstinence from any sexual behavior outside of heterosexual marriage. So I don't think anyone would claim this is the only explanation, but this is a piece of the puzzle given kind of the water that he was swimming in.
And you also wrote, quote, some saw a connection between strict sexual beliefs and violence against Asian women in particular. Is this purity culture being used to reinforce any sorts of racist sexual stereotypes of Asian women?
The intersection of all this is so complicated. I did talk to one man he's a religious studies professor now, but had grown up in this kind of strict evangelical, strict sexual culture of this evangelical culture. And, he was making a connection that purity culture really punishes any women that it views as not perfectly modest, perfectly chaste. And then meanwhile, there is also this cultural tendency to over-sexualize Asian women. And so when you put those things together, there is a real overlap there.
So there are a lot of people, though, who hear this sexual addiction argument and see this as an excuse for the shooter. So, walk us through why it may not be so simple, why that may not be the case.
Sure. And I don't think that, looking at this culture in any way excuses it. Sort of digging in here does not necessarily mean that therefore this is a sufficient explanation for what happened at all. One thing that came up in this piece is this idea of sexual exceptionalism. That's a term that I got from a sociologist named Sam Perry. And the idea is in this culture, sexual sins are often implied to be much more serious than other categories of sin. And that can just lead to anyone who violates, again, this very strict idea of no kind of sexual activity outside of straight marriage. That becomes a sin of just gargantuan proportions, can lead to just incredible anguish, incredible guilt. Conservative evangelicals actually use pornography a little bit less than the general population, but they feel significantly more guilt afterwards. And again, not to use guilt as an excuse or a total explanation for this, but I think if we're looking at his mindset and just his own account of events, that would play a role in his mindset leading up to this.
Ruth Graham, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thanks.